In the spring of 1941, a German Jewish philosopher named Hannah Arendt was arrested by the Gestapo in Berlin. She was 34 years old, and she'd already spent years watching her world be methodically taken apart. Her job, her passport, her academic career, all of it stripped away, not because of anything she'd done, but because of what she was born. After 8 days in custody, she managed to talk her way out before the charges were formalized. She fled Germany, crossed into France, was interned in a camp in the Pyrenees when France fell, then escaped during a chaotic mass evacuation and walked across the mountains into Spain, with her husband and her mother. By the time she reached New York, nearly a year after leaving, she arrived with almost nothing to her name, finding that even her native language was completely useless in this strange new country. The people responsible for all of this, the officials, the bureaucrats, the guards, the neighbors who had simply looked away, none of them were ever meaningfully punished. Most went on to live ordinary lives. Some were later given respectable careers in post-war Germany. The machinery that had classified her, processed her, stripped her of everything she'd built, mostly just continued operating under new management. By any rational measure, Hannah Arendt had every justification to spend the rest of her life in the locked room of her own bitterness, and she would have been right to. Instead, she spent the following 3 decades producing some of the most important political philosophy of the 20th century. And somewhere inside that work, in a book called The Human Condition, published in 1958, she wrote something that I keep returning to, something that has never quite let me go since I first stumbled across it. She wrote that forgiveness is the only human action that is genuinely new. Every other thing we do is, in some sense, a response to what came before, a reaction, a consequence, a continuation of a chain that was already in motion. Forgiveness alone breaks the chain. It introduces something into the world that wasn't there before. It is, in her exact words, the only reaction which does not merely react, but acts anew. She was not writing from a place of spiritual comfort or easy grace. The people who had wronged her, many of them never apologized. Many died unrepentant, even honored. She had received nothing that most people would consider sufficient grounds for letting go. And still, she arrived at forgiveness, not as a feeling of warmth toward those who had harmed her, not as an absolution of what they'd done, but as a deliberate act of freedom. A choice made entirely for her own sake. She was describing something that doesn't wait for the other person to deserve it and doesn't require them to participate at all. Buddhism, which had been quietly working on this exact same problem for about 2,500 years before, Arendt sat down to write, arrived at the same understanding by a completely different road. That's what I want to trace with you today. Think about that one person. You know exactly who I mean. There's probably a face that appeared before I'd even finished that sentence. Maybe it's an ex-partner, someone whose absence still reorganizes the room when a particular song comes on in the car, or when you walk past the restaurant where you used to go on the first Saturday of every month. Maybe it's a parent, and the wound is so old and so deep that you've mostly stopped trying to explain it to people, because you've learned that it doesn't translate well. It just sounds like ordinary family stuff until you're actually inside it. Maybe it's a friend who shared something you'd told them in confidence, and you found out the way you always find out about these things, from someone else at the worst possible moment. You might not have spoken to this person in years, and yet they haven't left. They show up at 2 a.m. when something wakes you and you can't get back to sleep. They're there in the middle of an otherwise decent conversation when something triggers the memory, and suddenly you're not in the room anymore. You're back in that moment, running through it again, finally saying the thing you should have said, watching them understand exactly what they did to you. You've tried to move on, and in many ways you have. You may have worked through parts of it in therapy, or journaled about it until the journal was full, or told the story to your closest friends so many times that you can feel, even as you're telling it, a slight shift in their attention. They love you, they're listening, but they've heard this before and you both know it. You've told yourself calmly and rationally that carrying this is not doing you any good. You can articulate that clearly. You've probably explained it to other people. And still, there they are, occupying some quiet corner of your mind without paying a cent for the privilege. I'm not going to spend much time on whether your anger is justified, because it probably is. And anyway, that's not really what this is about. What I actually want to get at is the mechanical question underneath all of it. What is the mind doing when it holds on to a grievance like this? Why does it keep returning to the same wound and pressing on it, even when pressing on it never once makes it hurt less? Part of what makes this so hard to talk about, honestly, is that we live in a culture that has fully absorbed the idea that forgiveness is the right thing to do, without ever really explaining what forgiveness actually is. Somewhere along the way, most of us picked up the instruction from therapists, from self-help books, from well-meaning friends who genuinely want us to be okay, and we internalized it as a kind of moral obligation. We know we should let go. We want to let go in the abstract. We can articulate, clearly and rationally, all the reasons why holding on is hurting us more than it's hurting them. And then we lie awake at 2 a.m., replaying the argument anyway. That gap between genuinely wanting to forgive and finding yourself completely unable to isn't a character flaw, and it isn't evidence that you haven't tried hard enough. It's what happens when you're given an outcome without being given any real understanding of the process that leads to it. Most forgiveness advice is essentially moral pressure, dressed up in gentle language. It describes where you should arrive without ever mapping the actual terrain between here and there. And you cannot navigate territory you don't have a map for, no matter how sincerely you want to reach the destination. What the Buddha understood, and what I want to actually trace with you carefully, is the mechanism, not the outcome. The mechanism. Over 2,500 years ago, the Buddha perfectly described this psychological trap, using the image of two arrows in the Salatha Sutta, one of the shorter texts preserved in the Pali Canon. He asks his monks to imagine being struck by an arrow. The pain is immediate and real. Nobody disputes that. There's no wisdom tradition anywhere in the world that asks you to pretend a wound isn't a wound, or that betrayal doesn't hurt, or that being genuinely wronged by someone you trusted is somehow a spiritual opportunity you should feel grateful for. The first arrow is real, and the Buddha was explicit that it belongs in its own category, unavoidable, legitimate pain. But then, and this is the part that either lands immediately or takes years to fully hear, most people reach for a second arrow and shoot themselves with it. The second arrow isn't the wound. It's everything the mind does to the wound afterward. The obsessive replaying, the building of the case, the questions that spiral without ever arriving anywhere useful. How could they have done this? What does it say about them? What does it say about me that I didn't see it coming? The second arrow is the entire architecture of meaning that gets constructed on top of the original pain, the story that keeps the wound alive and pointed inward for months or years or sometimes the better part of a lifetime. The first arrow, in other words, is not optional. The second one almost always is, though the mind rarely presents it that way. This distinction is what Buddhism calls dukkha, a word that most Western translations render as suffering, but which points at something more specific than that. The word comes from an old Pali term describing a wheel whose axle doesn't sit quite right in the hub. It rolls, it functions, but there's a constant friction to it, a grinding that never fully goes away. That's the texture of a life organized around an unexamined grievance. It isn't catastrophic or dramatic. It's just a constant, exhausting friction between the life you're actually living and the version playing in the background of your mind. The one where this person finally understands what they did, where you finally receive the acknowledgement that was owed to you. Buddhism's actual recommendation at this point is frequently misunderstood, and the misunderstanding matters. It does not say let go, at least not in the way that phrase is usually deployed. If letting go were simply a matter of deciding to, you would have done it. The fact that you haven't isn't weakness. It's evidence that the mind is doing something real with the grievance, something that feels necessary on some level, something that serves a function you haven't fully identified yet. The technical term for what's happening is upadana, usually translated as clinging or attachment, though neither translation quite captures it. Upadana describes the act of holding on to something as though it were fixed, permanent, load-bearing, essential to the structure of who you are. And here is the mechanism that most forgiveness conversations never reach somewhere in your nervous system. A conclusion has been quietly established, not as a conscious decision, but as a felt truth, that releasing the grievance means releasing the wrong, that forgiveness is a kind of erasure, that letting go is the same thing as saying it didn't matter, or that it was acceptable, or that the person who hurt you somehow gets to walk away clean, while you're the one doing the difficult, internal work of releasing them. This is the central confusion, and it explains almost everything about why forgiveness is so much harder than it sounds, because you're not afraid of forgiving them. You're afraid that forgiving them means what happened to you stops being real. Think about what we actually do with our resentments over time, not just in the abstract, but in practice. We maintain them, we update them, we notice new evidence. A comment a mutual friend lets slip, a social media post that confirms exactly what we suspected, a pattern we recognize in a new context that connects back to the original wound. We organize our understanding of that whole period of our lives around the grievance, the way you'd arrange furniture in a room around the one piece that's too heavy to move. Everything works. But there's always that one thing at the center that nothing can get past. And here is the part that's genuinely uncomfortable to hear. The grievance is giving you something real. It gives you clarity. This person is the problem, which means you are not the problem. It gives you a coherent story about a period of your life that might otherwise feel chaotic or humiliating or simply unresolved. The psychologist Robert Caron, who spent years studying shame and forgiveness, described this as the grievance story, the carefully maintained, internally rehearsed account of a harm that we carry and periodically retell. Each retelling reinforces the neural pathway. Each reinforcement makes the story feel more essentially true, more load-bearing. And eventually the story becomes part of the architecture of who you are, what you survived, what you're owed, what you've learned about the world, and the people in it. At that point, the grievance isn't just a memory, it's a pillar. There's an exchange recorded from a 9th century Chinese Chan master named Huangbo, whose conversations were preserved in a text called the Huangbo Transmission of Mind. A student came to him after many years of dedicated practice and said, "I have been trying to release my anger toward my father. For 30 years, I have meditated, I have sat with teachers, I have done everything that was asked of me, and the anger hasn't moved. What am I doing wrong?" Huangbo considered this for a moment. Then he said, "You're still trying to get rid of it." The student didn't understand the first time I read that exchange. Neither did I. It sounds almost like a koan designed to be unhelpful. But what Huangbo was pointing at is something that takes time to settle into the body rather than just the intellect. The active campaign against your own resentment, the daily effort to suppress it, redirect it, outrun it, is itself a form of attachment. Declaring war on a feeling is still a relationship with that feeling. The war against your resentment still keeps the grievance at the center of your attention, still makes the other person the axis around which your inner life turns. You're just pointing the energy inward rather than outward. What the tradition actually recommends, and this is where modern trauma therapy has independently arrived at the exact same conclusion through a completely different methodology, is not elimination but investigation. Not get this out of me, but let me actually look at what this is. What does the resentment feel like right now, not as a story, but as a physical sensation? Where does it live in the body? What happens when you stay with the raw texture of the feeling for 10 seconds without immediately launching into the narrative of it? This is the foundation of what the Theravada tradition calls vipassana insight practice, and the insight that most people encounter when they actually do this honestly is almost always the same. Underneath the resentment, once the story quiets down for a moment, there is something softer, usually grief. The grief of something specific that was lost, not just what they did, but what you had hoped for, what you needed and didn't receive, what you believed the relationship was and discovered it wasn't. Sometimes there is something underneath that, too, a wound that existed before this person arrived, a pattern they activated rather than created. Most people never reach that layer because the resentment works too well as a surface. It's loud, it's directed, it gives the mind something to do. Grief is quieter, and it asks you to sit still with something that has no target and no resolution. Just loss, plain and unadorned. The mind finds that considerably harder than anger, which is at least a form of energy. That is the actual work. Not forgiving the person, not even really thinking about the person, learning to see what you've actually lost clearly enough to grieve it properly. So the resentment no longer has to perform the exhausting job of keeping the loss from being forgotten. The Buddha's most frequently quoted observation on this, that holding on to anger is like picking up a burning coal to throw at someone when you are the only one guaranteed to be burned, has been repeated so many times, it's lost most of its force, but the image is still exact. The coal is in your hand. The longer you hold it, the deeper the wound. The person you intend to throw it at may be entirely unbothered right now, asleep, at dinner with people who make them laugh, living the life they built after whatever happened between you, and you're standing there palm blistering, still gripping. The question the tradition eventually presses you toward isn't whether they deserve your forgiveness. It's whether you deserve your own freedom. And those are two entirely different questions, with two entirely different answers. I want to say something here that most conversations about forgiveness carefully avoid. Because I'd rather be honest with you than leave you with a version of this that falls apart the first time you actually try to put it into practice. Some people genuinely do not deserve forgiveness, in any emotional or moral sense of that word. Some of what happened to you was deliberately unjust, not a misunderstanding, not a moment of weakness, but a choice made by someone who understood what they were doing and did it anyway. That person has never acknowledged it, has never made amends, may be entirely unaware that you're still carrying this and has suffered no consequences whatsoever. Nothing about the Buddhist teaching I've just described changes any of that. It doesn't ask you to decide that what they did was acceptable or understandable or the result of their own suffering, and it doesn't ask you to tell them you've forgiven them, because that conversation is rarely as healing as people imagine it will be, and occasionally it makes things considerably worse. What it asks is something much narrower and in some ways much harder. It asks you to stop punishing yourself for what they did, because the internal courtroom where you've been prosecuting this case, replaying the evidence, delivering the verdict for the 10,000th time, maintaining the full machinery of grievance. They are not in that courtroom. They were never in that courtroom. You have been playing every role yourself, the prosecutor, the defendant, the judge, the jury, and the person who cannot find the exit, because the door locks from the inside. The sentence keeps getting handed down, and it keeps falling entirely on you when you genuinely begin to loosen your grip on a long-held grievance, not performing it for an audience or even for yourself, but actually doing it. You will grieve, real grief, maybe for the first time, in the way that the original loss actually warranted, because the resentment has been doing the work of an anesthetic. Anger has a target, it has direction, and momentum, and in its own way, a kind of intimacy with the person who hurt you. It keeps the relationship alive, keeps the matter open, keeps you in a position where the story isn't finished yet. There's something almost comfortable about it, even when it's painful. Grief doesn't have any of that. Grief is just the plain fact of what's gone, what you wanted and didn't receive, what you had and lost, what the relationship was supposed to be and turned out not to be. It will hurt differently than the anger has hurt you. It will feel more final, and for a period, it genuinely may feel worse. But grief moves. That's the distinction that matters most. You go into it and, eventually, you come out the other side, into something that isn't fully healed, but is genuinely different, quieter with more space in it, with less of your daily energy being quietly consumed by maintenance. Chronic resentment doesn't move. It circles, it returns to the same coordinates, makes the same case, reaches the same verdict, then starts over. Grief has a direction and an end. Resentment has only repetition. If you've been carrying something for a long time, a decade, 2 decades, or longer than you'd like to think about, there's a specific fear I want to address, because I've heard it often enough that I'm fairly sure it's sitting somewhere nearby as you take this in. The fear is that it's too late, that so many years have already been shaped by this wound, so many decisions made, so many narratives constructed, so much of your self-understanding organized around what happened. That releasing it now would retroactively invalidate all of that time. That laying down the resentment after carrying it this long is tantamount to admitting the carrying was wasted. And that feels like one more loss you can't afford, like a final betrayal of the person you had to be for all those years in order to survive what happened to you. I want to offer you a different way of holding that. You didn't carry that resentment arbitrarily. You carried it because it was doing something real, protecting something, preserving your sense of what was true, keeping you in right relationship with your own experience of what had happened to you. That's not pathology. That's a mind doing what minds do with pain that arrives faster than it can be processed. The resentment was a container for something that didn't yet have another container. It served a function, and the fact that you've arrived at a place where you can begin to question whether you still need it isn't failure. That's the process working exactly as it's supposed to work. You couldn't have arrived here any sooner than you have. Buddhism is quite explicit about this. The path doesn't run on a schedule. You arrive at readiness, when you arrive at readiness, and not a moment before. And there is nothing in the tradition that suggests earlier is better. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki spent the last decade of his life teaching in California, introducing more Western practitioners to seated meditation than perhaps anyone else of his generation. And he returned constantly to a phrase that sounds almost dismissively simple, until you've sat with it for a while, not always so. He wasn't using it to minimize anyone's experience. He was pointing at something subtler, that what feels permanently and immovably true about a situation, the story that has calcified into certainty over years of rehearsal, might look different from a slightly different position. Not wrong, not invalid, but not the only view available either. That capacity, holding your own experience fully, while simultaneously knowing that other framings of it exist, doesn't come from reading the right book. It comes from years of discovering you were wrong about things you were entirely certain of, from watching your own certainties get quietly revised by time and loss, and the slow accumulation of a life lived at some depth. That is not something young people have. It belongs to people who have already been through things. It belongs to you, and it makes you more equipped for this particular work right now than you've ever been before. The one thing I'd like to leave with you, not a practice, not a list of steps, just one thing, is this. The next time you find yourself back in that internal courtroom replaying the case at 2 a.m., or in the shower, or during the 30-second pause before you respond to an email that has nothing to do with any of this, instead of running the prosecution again, See if you can just notice that you're there. That's genuinely all I'm asking. Not to fix it, not to resolve it, not to perform some kind of spiritual release that you're not actually feeling. Just to notice the experience of being in that room, what it actually feels like